Hey everyone, welcome to another design diary. A couple weeks ago, I did a video showing off that I'd gotten my first actual professional printed prototypes and was showing off some of the cards and tokens and such. You may or may not have noticed what was not in there was any boards, meaning a game board, or this game also has player boards. And those were not in there because I did not order any to get printed because they were still very much completely in progress, not even a prototype that I was ready to print. Just this week, kind of finally got to something on those that I'm sure is not final. I'm sure will continue to change a lot, but I actually feel is like good enough to, I'm going to go ahead and order some to get printed and actually have something that looks a little more professional for some upcoming play testing. The latest version of the game board and the player mats also actually kind of for the first time feel more or less like I want the game to feel, and I think actually function in a useful way. I've been doing some play tests recently with kind of different versions of the board and seeing where problems cropped up and stuff. So anyway, I thought what I'd do today is just a quick kind of overview of the history of figuring out even a board. And I guess for anyone who happens to be watching this trying to get advice on game design, first, maybe I'm not the best person to go to because this is my first one, but maybe you can avoid some of my rookie mistakes. The biggest thing I would say that I've learned is to start thinking about design a little earlier. And I've talked about this in some other videos. I was very focused on the mechanics and I was just designing a lot of stuff on screen and printed out some things for early playtests that were really just to weird scales and stuff like that. And those worked. I got useful stuff out of the playtests and such. But at some point you hit a point in the design where the game's mechanics are more or less working and you're still tweaking stuff and things, but where it's close enough that you need to start thinking about something that's actually like a practical prototype, or could eventually become an actual physical game. And that was one of the things where I needed to kind of really start thinking about the size of things. So for instance, just looking at where you're going to get it printed. If you're having this professionally manufactured, like you're going to get bought by a publisher, probably gives more flexibility there. I'm planning on doing a Kickstarter and kind of initial printing of these myself. We'll see where things go, but that's the current plan. So looking at websites where you can do, game design and get prototypes printed and, even do some mass printing of stuff. There's certain standard sizes of boards that are a lot cheaper than if you're ordering some custom size. So thinking about that, and then thinking of just practical question of how big do fonts need to be so we can read them? How big can the board be, or how small can it be for things to still be practical? And I'll show you some examples of that. Anyway, just kind of wanted to walk you through the history here. I thought it might be kind of interesting to see how I got from where it was, and then I'll show you kind of where we actually are today. Here is the very first board design I had for this. This was the one I used on an early tabletop simulator to do my very first play test. You'll see there's some stuff that actually stayed conceptually kind of similar through the rest of it. One of the things I eventually ended up doing was figuring out what decks needed to be where, what decks could just be off to the side and didn't need to be on the board because that was taking up space. One of these scales actually completely disappeared from the game. But these other ones are relatively similar to what happened. And this I'm going to come back to a few times. This is a map of where you are in your career, whether you're in grad school and going through classes or on a renewable track or on the tenure track, and kind of how you move through that. This is something that is really crucial to where you are in your progression in the game, but has really been a challenge to figure out kind of how to execute smoothly and where it would go on the board. Anyway, so this is the first draft. Like I said, this was one I was just doing on my screen and for Tabletop Simulator. If I pull up some info here and you do the math on this, the actual size of this board, I printed out one version of it for a very early playtest, is over 4 feet by 4 feet. It was huge. I don't actually still have that printout, or I would show you how it looks. But this was obviously completely impractical. And one of the things you'll notice, even looking at this very small on your screen here, you can still read all these things. And this is one of the artifacts of just working only on the screen, not realizing how big some of this stuff actually was. It is to scale in the sense of I figured out how big I needed the cards to be and kind of use those as a marker for things. But then I was kind of trying to make everything legible, even when I had the whole board on screen, when I'm kind of zoomed way out like this, as opposed to actually seeing it in real life. And some of these fonts turned out to just be huge. Anyway, so that was the very first iteration of this. And I went through a couple of variations on that, not really making major changes. I'll say the board has kind of been one of the last things I wanted to deal with. I was still really figuring out mechanics and figuring out what the cards would be and how the game played and stuff. And that to me was all more important than figuring out exactly what the board would end up looking like. And I think that was the right choice and the right place to focus. But I'll just note the board was not a high priority for a lot of the early design and playtesting of this. And if you're curious, this was the player mat for that version of the board. And you'll see a lot of the core concepts stayed the same through all these, although they got tweaked and iterated and hopefully improved along the way. But you'll still see some things that keep showing up. So there is something here about the various requirements you have to do where you're spending your time on your social life or teaching, service, and research. That remained constant. Then these sort of optional things you could do, having some research projects you're working on, a card for your character, that's remained the same. There's some stuff about jobs that turn out to be different. There actually is still a partner card for your romantic interest. In this very early version, I might talk about this in another design diary, there were a lot of different people. So you could actually pick a specific person you were dating, and now it's just sort of a generic partner. And then this lifestyle thing, which is another element that's kind of been here from the beginning, but has undergone a lot of tweaks. Most noticeably, you'll see in this one, there were actually 6 different levels of lifestyle, and they all affected your satisfaction. There's now 3, and satisfaction is no longer a thing in the game, so they kind of have a different impact depending on what level you're at there. But anyway, that was the player board for this. So here is the next kind of major step forward, and I'm just showing you this file on the computer, which is my Illustrator file, and I've actually changed computers and changed fonts since then, and it's all pink because some of these I don't have the font still on my computer, but I do actually still have a printout of this one from a playtest. So here's what this one looked like. It's still very large, although it's no longer 4 feet by 4 feet. And here it is on the table. And then I used this pen and Post-it note for a couple of these photos so you can kind of have something for sense of scale. Here it is with those on it so you can kind of get a sense of how big it is. And you'll still see a lot of the same information was there. You can see at this point I've already gone down to only 3 lifestyle levels instead of 6. That was something that changed pretty quickly. Also related to lifestyle, started to put in some things that actually would continue even into the current version of the game, such as your lifestyle had a different effect depending on how far into the game you were. Basically that when you're younger you can kind of put up with more. Also that the impacts and satisfaction was going to be on your energy reserve, or what's now called stamina. Basically if you're living a better lifestyle, you can kind of build up some energy, less stress and stuff in your life. And if you're really struggling to get by financially, that's kind of like eating away at your stamina and your reserves for dealing with other problems. So that was a step forward in the design, kind of starting to figure out what some things needed to be and shrinking it down a little bit, but still pretty large. It's still a very large board. And that's not even getting to the player board. Now, one of the things that changed is you may have noticed that that giant map of where you are in your job track has disappeared off the game board because we tried moving that to the player board. So here's an example of the player board, which is probably too big to fit on my screen kind of where I am, where I'm holding this, but let me pull up a photo of this on the table. And that way you can kind of see it in its full width, and some things were reorganized. You can see change kind of how the dating and partner track worked, change the child track a little bit, and started to reorganize some other stuff in terms of where options showed up, where your costs were. This was a few versions ago, so I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think if I remember right, all the different optional actions you could do during your turn, instead of being printed on the player board, at this time moved to a card, and there was a card that had kind of different actions you could do, and you would hold onto the card and look at that. That was a different way of trying. As I started to mention before, though, the big thing is that the job track, the map, has moved from the main game board onto the player board. So it's over here on the left of the player board. The problem here is once I did that, there was not, again, this is before I was spending a ton of time on design this, just kind of doing this quickly for playtesting. There wasn't really a good way to have everything on there without the player board being 6 feet long. So what I did instead was had kind of an overlay, and this was an idea I was playing with at that time about maybe there'd be some part of the player mat that you flip over from one side to the other, or an overlay that you can put on and off depending on where you're on the job track. You can see here a little video of it. There's a grad school version of the track that you would start with in the beginning of the game, and then you can take that off and go on to the job track. It's a little inconvenient, we found in some of the playtests, because sometimes someone might go to grad school and then get their master's leave, go get a job, and then would want to try to go back to grad school, and you have to put that map back on. And sometimes there might be places where you want to see what's going on with the job track and well, should I take this job or do this, or should I be in grad school? And you kind of only see one of them at the time. But that was kind of the idea of what we're doing with that. The other thing I'll note is this was the first design that I did some larger group playtests with, and just the size of things made this really unwieldy. I ended up doing some of these playtests at my work in a conference room on a giant conference table, because that was the only way to actually fit everything. If you look at this is showing on my dining room table. You can see just having that size game board and then 2 players with their mats is filling up most of your table. This is a pretty good sized table, and we normally seat 6 at it, but you could actually squeeze 8 or 10. And this was filling up the whole space. And so if you're trying to play with, say, 4 players, you really need a bigger table than most people would have. And again, I was never expecting these were final designs, but that was one of those things that starts to cue you in about, okay, I really got to work on the design for this and start thinking about some practicalities and scale and stuff like that. So those were some early designs, and then I'll show you one more recent one, and then kind of where we are right now, which is, I'm not going to say final because a lot of stuff obviously still needs to be tested and worked on, and I'm sure there will be tweaks, but the first one that I actually feel like is close enough to where we want to be that I'm going to go ahead and get it printed for some playtests and see how it works in reality and see what the board looks like actually professionally printed and stuff like that. So here is the main game board one iteration ago, and you can see it's been simplified a lot. Most of the decks have moved off the board. You can see there's a couple things at the top showing you put a deck like right above this and then draw some cards here so you kind of know where those slots are. There's one thing for cards here, one deck that's actually fully on the board. Got rid of a lot of the cards, that saves some stuff. You can see I talked about in another design diary these achievement tracks that are now part of the game that weren't in those early designs. And here's your personal attribute trackers, which go from 0 to 10, and now it actually is kind of like you're climbing up a little ivory tower with my terrible graphics that I just whipped through in Illustrator here. Again, not final design, but just giving the idea there actually could be some kind of tower in the middle, and you go up the tower as you go. And then here's your various lifestyle things, which again, that's one of those things that have moved back and forth between the player board and main board in various iterations. At this point, they are back on the main board. And then this is something else that was different. If I go back to these previous iterations, you can see there was always a year tracker that you just kind of move up, and it was marking every 5. And this one, I simplified that a lot and just made this kind of cycle. So you kind of each year move this around the cycle, and when you get to this icon here, that tells you like, hey, it's been 5 years, check in on these things. And then every time you go around the cycle, this moves up 1. And there's some other things that are affected by what cycle you're on. For instance, if you're trying to have a kid, kind of the further along you get into the game, the less likely you are to be able to naturally have a kid. So here is the size of that one. You can see all of these are just printed like on a printer and then taped together on regular size sheets. So again, these were not professionally done, but printed to scale. So you can see it's a lot smaller than the other one. The fonts and stuff are readable, but not so gigantic as they were in some of the other things. Here's a picture of it on the table, again with that Post-it note and pen, just to give you some sense of scale. And then here's the player board for this one, which is still kind of wide, but hopefully fitting the whole thing in the picture here. I'll switch to photo of it on the table. And you can see the map of where you are in your job or in grad school has stayed on the player mat in this version. Again, still playing with that idea of layers or overlays just to make the size of the player map manageable. This one has one version of that map for in grad school and one version for when you are not in grad school and working at a job or something. And so you can see there's just one part of this that you take on and off for that, but the rest of it stays the same. And just like the main board, you can see that instead of taking up a lot of space on the board with cards, there's just sort of places where they'll go. So it says like character card here, and so your character card would kind of slot in along the bottom here, so there's kind of icons for where things should go, but they're not actually on the physical board. And here's a photo of how that lays out on the table, which you can see is much more manageable. You can fit a couple players and the game board in the middle, and you can see if we did have 4 or 5 players, they can all kind of sit around the table, and their players' mats are small enough that they can sit next to each other if you have a wider table, and you can fit the main board in between everybody. So just in a practical sense, everything can fit on a table with multiple players, which is good. And that brings me to the current version of where we are. So here's the game board that I'm actually having printed. You can see it's actually a little bit bigger than the last one. Similar in design, you can see, but some things were moved around. Mainly it's a little bit wider, and that was to accommodate that I've moved the map of where you are in the job or grad school world back onto the main board. As much as I kind of liked the idea and thought it was a cool concept, I didn't feel like the overlays and kind of taking those on and off ever really quite worked. It seemed more complicated than it needed to be. And it always meant that you couldn't kind of see everything at once, and you sometimes would be having to put the overlay back on and off. The other thing was thinking about this is taking up a lot of space on your player board, and you're only ever going to have like one token on there. You're only in one spot on it. And this is something, instead of everyone's player board needing to have it, if we can centralize that on the main board, everybody can use the same one, and their player board can really focus on stuff that is specific and unique to them. Now, there's some stuff that's repeated across player mats in terms of like different actions and stuff you can do, because everyone could be doing those actions. But those are all places where you could be playing some time tokens or needing to move around other things, whereas you're only ever going to have your character on one spot on the job track, and they're only going to move once a year generally, unless you're switching to a new job or something like that. Ultimately, getting that back onto the main board made a lot of sense to me, and you can see the way it's organized here. Did a little bit of color coding with the backgrounds. There's like a grad school section, a full-time academic job section, and then a section for no full-time academic job. And then also adjunct teaching was something that I've tried all sorts of variations for where that ended up. Sometimes it was on a card, sometimes it was on the player mat, sometimes it was on the main mat. That ended up seeming to make sense to have here on the main mat, along with the rest of the info about the job tracks. One other thing you might notice is new is that little map of the US divided into 4 regions. Location has always been a part of the game. I talked about in another design diary that it was important to me to convey this idea that sometimes in academia you don't have a lot of choice of where you go. You go where the job is, and you may want to live on the West Coast, and instead you find a job in the Southeast, and that's where you go. So the regions are on the job cards and on the grad school cards to show where is the institution at. And they're also actually on the character card. So you have a home region, and so this character's home region is in the South, and you get a bonus if you end up in that region, because that's kind of where you want to be. And then they also have a region that they don't want to be. In this case, they get extra stress if they move to the Northeast, because that's apparently a region this character doesn't want to be. And one thing I was finding in some playtests is it's just kind of hard sometimes to keep track of where people were. So I added this map on the main game board where you can put a token showing where your character is, and then when they go to somewhere else, you move them, and that way there's always some record of where you are. And it also just reemphasizes like, hey, keep track of where you are, and there's certain regions that are going to be better or worse for you. So that's the main game board. And then for the player mats, I went with a different kind of design than anything else I had tried, but I actually really liked this. And a shout out to Ethan, my graphic designer, who mainly was working on the icons and stuff, but took a stab at this and really figured out some ways to redesign the player board and kind of organize things in a different way that sparked some new directions and ultimately kind of led to this. So now there's 2, but they're not overlays. They don't sit on top of each other. There's one for your professional life and one for your personal life, and they kind of sit next to each other, and your character card goes in the middle. And you can see the token or marker for your stress level actually sits on the player mat, but it connects to a scale on the character card. And that was something that I tried using clips on the character card, and the clips slide up and down, and I may eventually still do something like that, but current version I'm trying it just using tokens on the player mat. So you can see there are still some of these things, so like action cards and your research projects, you actually play kind of above and below the board. So there are still some things that are not sitting on it, but now your sort of core cards, so your job, there's actually 2 cards that relate, and one of them kind of tucks under the other one. So you see like the title of the job up here, and then you see some information about it down here. That actually sits on the mat, and same thing with your partner card on the personal side. So if you're dating or married to someone, that sits here. I kind of like that. There were kind of starting to be too many cards hanging around outside the player mat, and they're just getting unwieldy. It also kind of focuses in on, hey, these are the most important things on each side, your partner side here and your job here. And you can see there's broken down, here's your required actions where you can play things, here's your optional actions, and different tokens and stuff you need to collect are here. And actually even had some room here for some rules about what happens when you change jobs, which was another thing that I've tried putting some different places. I'm really trying, because I want this to be something people kind of jump in on with not a lot of instruction ahead of time to have all the important rules and steps and stuff you're supposed to do printed somewhere, whether it's on the game board or on your player mat or on a card, so that you're never like, okay, I know I'm supposed to do something with this, but I don't know what, that the things are more self-explanatory and like, okay, I'm taking a new job, what do I do? Oh, there's this thing right here. It says when I take a new job, do these 3 things, and then I know how that works. So that was something I liked. I feel pretty good about how this design is looking. And the other thing, just thematically, I like about this is if you look at this visually, it kind of has your character with things pulling them in 2 different directions. On one side is your personal life, and on the other side is your work life. And that's a major component of the game, is how you balance out those 2 things and kind of try to make progress in both. So thematically, I just like this visual of splitting those with your character in the middle, kind of joining the 2 sides together and reminding you you're trying to work on both of these separately. Here's what that looks like with 2 players and the game mat in the middle. And again, this is a small enough size that there's enough room to have a couple players on one side of the table, a couple players on the other, and the board in the middle if you're playing with, 4 players, let's say. Last thing I'll say, just to call back to the beginning, is thinking practically. And one of the things I've learned and actually did put into practice with this current version is thinking about what it will eventually cost to make these things. So the game board is a standard size. I looked at the place where I'm manufacturing at least the prototypes. There are different websites will have some different standard sizes, and found, okay, here's some options of standard sizes for the board, and tried playing with various ones of those and found one that I could make work for what I wanted to do. Same thing with these. The site that I'm using, Board Games Maker, has a standard 10 by 10 mat, like player mat, that you can do, and that's very inexpensive compared to some of the other versions where they're going to be custom sizes or larger sizes that were a lot more expensive. And actually, it turns out, printing 2 of these 10 by 10 ones and putting them next to each other is a lot cheaper than printing like one large board. Now, I'm not saying do things just based on cost. You got to do what works for the game. And I tried a lot of different options. I tried some other mat options and sizes to try to find something that worked. And, it may still end up that we'd go back to a single mat, but I really liked this concept. And when I found that those were sizes I could use that were in the right ballpark of what I was looking for anyway, it's one of those things where sometimes it is good to have a little bit of a constraint, as opposed to just, I'm going to make whatever I want and any size I want. And if I need to add a few inches here to make things work, I can. This sort of forced me to think like, okay, if I'm confined to this size, what stuff really needs to be on here? What stuff doesn't? How big does it need to be so I can read it, so I can fit tokens in the right spot, so the cards match up, all those sort of things. And that actually was a help, because instead of having infinite possibilities, you have this limited set of possibilities. Like, okay, I know I need to fit into this, and here's the information I think I need to fit in there. And if it fits, here's how it's going to fit. And if it doesn't fit, does that mean I need a different size, or does that mean I have some stuff on here that I don't actually need, or that I'm not thinking of how it's laid out in the right way? That's where we are now. I'm excited to get some of these things printed and to do some play tests with this latest board and player mats and see how those go. Fingers crossed, hopefully everything goes well. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.